Cornell Tech, and it's my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome you to this celebration of Walter LaFeber's life, work, and family and events here. I'd like to particularly thank the LaFeber family for coming and participating in this. Sandy and Scott, as well as Suzanne and her husband Tom and sons Matt and Trevor. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Oops, did I miss one? Sylvie, apologies. Well, I'm saving the best for last, Sylvie, of course, yeah. Walter, of course, was one of the most prominent historians of his time and had a tremendous effect on legions of Cornellians. Unfortunately, I never got the chance to meet him, but all of my colleagues in Ithaca raved about him and sort of claimed he was the consummate academic. And although I'm a computer scientist by training and about as far from Walter's work on everything from foreign policy to law and finance and so forth, Walter and I did have one key thing in common that I read about. He and I both had offers from Harvard. However, Walter was much smarter than me, and he declined that offer. And it took me, I had to learn the hard way that Cornell was the right place to actually be an academic. So speaking of Cornell, I'd like you, as I said, welcome to the Cornell Tech campus. How many of you have actually been to Roosevelt Island before? Oh, wow, okay, much bigger proportion than I'm used to. Usually when I ask people that question, especially New Yorkers, only about 10% sort of raise their hand. So anyway, welcome back to those of you who've come, and welcome to those of you who have not. If you don't know our campus, this got started about a decade ago with some key help from people like Andy Tisch, who is a class of 71, but also one of the co-organizers of this event. So thank you so much, Andrew, for all that you're doing. But this event was also co-organized by Richard Immerman, also class of 71. Richard is the Marvin Wachman Director Emeritus at the Center for the Study of Force and Diplomacy at Temple University. And so I'd like to welcome Richard and have him come to the podium and follow up. Please, thank you.
Someday I'm going to go up to a podium and not have to lower the microphone. I'm not sure when that will be, but you know, it could happen. Well, I am Richard Immerman. I have probably emailed at least every one of you in this room at least once. It's been a tremendous pleasure. Just using that as a segue, it is now my pleasure and my great privilege to provide this very brief, and I will emphasize brief, introduction for Dr. Colleen Barry, the Dean of Cornell's Jebby Brooks School of Public Policy. Let me amend that. She is the inaugural Dean of the Jebby Brooks School of Public Policy. The school was only established in the fall of 2021. So Dr. Barry really didn't have an opportunity to come to know Walt LaFeber, at least, you know, well. Yet she fully recognized what Walt meant to Cornell and how his teaching and scholarship were fundamental to Cornell's prominent voice in national and indeed global conversation and debates about public policy decades before the Brooks School was launched. Consequently, as soon as I contacted Dr. Brooks, Dean Brooks, about this conference and our broader project, she immediately offered to provide funding. And it is only with the generous support of the Brooks School that this conference, and more specifically this reception, was possible. So in addition to that, I just want to thank Dr. Brooks for everything. What is more, her understanding of the connection between Walt's teaching and scholarship and the mission of the Brooks School attests the wisdom of her appointment as the Brooks School inaugural dean. A distinguished scholar herself, Dr. Barry's expertise is far removed from the history of U.S. foreign relations. In fact, I hope somewhere during this conference she can explain to me what she got, because it's way above my sort of pay grade. She has focused her research on how health and social policies affect outcomes for individuals with mental illness and substance abuse, and how persuasive communication can influence public opinion about addiction, mental health, food systems and obesity, and violence. Elected to the Academy of Medicine, she's the author of over 200 peer-reviewed publications. She and Walt could probably have a good competition in terms of that, in leading medicine and health policy journals. And there's more. Prior to her selection as Brooks School's inaugural dean, Dr. Barry served on the faculty of Yale School of Public Health, and then as the Fred and Julie Soper Professor and Chair of Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health's Department of Health and Policy Management. She was also the founding director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Mental Health and Addiction Policy. I am sure many scholars of mental health and addiction policy, perhaps most, would have taken a pass on celebrating a historian of U.S. foreign relations, even one as renowned as Walt LaFeber. But admitting to my bias, I contend that what makes Colleen Barry such an outstanding scholar, such a perfect dean to propel the Brooks School to the top tier of public policy institutions, and such an ideal representative of Cornell to welcome us to this gathering to honor Walt, is her ability to think otherwise. So without further ado, and with great delight, I turn the mic over to Dean Barry.
Thank you, Richard. What a warm, welcoming introduction. I'm very honored and pleased to be here. It is just wonderful to see so many of you here today celebrating the incredible career of Professor Walter LaFeber. And I'm particularly glad to see so many Cornell alums in the audience. It's a testimony to Professor LaFeber that so many of his former students are here, that you have produced this tribute volume of writings reflecting on his enormous intellectual achievements, and that you've organized this conference together to celebrate him as a teacher and a scholar. In this sense, this conference is a fit follow-up to the incredible gathering at the Beacon Theater in 2006 for his farewell address. I'm so sorry that I did not have the opportunity to meet Professor LaFeber. But I'm pleased that our newly established School of Public Policy, the Brooks School, can support this wonderful event. Professor LaFeber's legendary course on the history of U.S. foreign policy that he taught to literally thousands and thousands of students over almost a 50-year period reflects his deep interest in and knowledge of public policy. And I want to just also briefly express my thanks to Andrew Tisch, who was the very first Cornellian who described to me what this experience was like of being in the classroom. I think maybe as during my second or third month as dean, and this experience of being told what it was like to be in that classroom has been repeated over the last few years that I have been dean again and again, but Andrew was the first. We academics start our university careers with the aspiration of having this type of profound impact on our students. Honestly, and I'm looking at Greg here now, there's no higher calling for us as professors, and very, very few of us come anywhere close to achieving that goal and to having the profound impact on our students and on their careers that Professor LaFeber had on his students and on their careers. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you tonight. I am here to listen and learn, and I'm very thankful to be a part of the event. Thank you all.
Now, you don't have to hear from me again. I am now going to introduce, very briefly, Doug Little and Andrew Tisch, who will be the MCs for the rest of the evening. It will begin, and I don't know which order, is that first we're going to show, they will show a tape, which are remarks by President Pollock, who very regretfully could not be here, but did tape some remarks for all of us. And then Andrew is going to introduce the tape of Walt's farewell address, which probably most of you have seen. A number of you attended. It's one of the most phenomenal, or great phenomenons, I guess, of academics in life. And Andrew, who, as he did so much, was vitally responsible for it, and he's going to tell a little bit about that in introducing us. And then following the tape itself, we will give everyone an opportunity to share their experiences and tribute to our favorite professor. So, Andrew and Doug, however you want to do your dog and pony show, it's fine with me, but the key is to show the tape at this point. Of that.
So before I get started, a big shout out to Richard and Andrew, without whom this would not have happened. Richard's hair is grayer than when I first met him, and it didn't all happen over the last couple of weeks, but close. So I think maybe what we'll do is to show the very nice greeting from from President Pollock, and then I know Andrew is going to tell us a few war stories about what it took to get Walt to agree to show up at the Beacon to deliver this address that we're going to see. So if we can cue up the welcome from Professor Pollock, or for President Pollock, and then Andrew can make his remarks. So let's do that.
Over the last few years, I have been fortunate to meet so many Cornell alumni from so many generations of graduates. When they talk about the experiences that they had at Cornell and the people who truly shaped their lives and careers, there's some names I hear more than any other. One of those names, of course, is Walter LaFeber. Professor LaFeber left a towering legacy of scholarship, writing or co-authoring more than 20 books on history and foreign policy, and speaking at dozens of universities, as well as on television and radio. But his former students rarely talk about that. What they talk about is how he captivated generations of Cornellians with hour-long lectures, famously delivered without notes, and followed not merely by applause, but by standing ovations. They talk about the line of students sitting in the hall during office hours, patiently waiting their turn, the turn they all got, because he didn't leave until he had talked to everyone. Most of all, Cornellians across decades talk about the impact that Professor LaFeber had on the way they saw the world, by bringing to life the people and the perspectives, the circumstances and the conversations that together form an historical narrative, and by inspiring them to pursue careers in academia or in public service. Professor LaFeber's legacy lives on through each of them, the students, the colleagues, the friends, and the thousands of Cornellians who spent their Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings seeing the world through his eyes and learning to think otherwise.
So here comes Andrew with the inside story.
Thanks, Doug. And when you talk about Richard, remembering what color hair Richard had, Richard and I go back to 7th grade together in Scarsdale Junior High School. So we go way, way back. But I just want to give you a little insight as to how the Beacon Theater came about. Long about beginning of 2006, Walt had been teaching past what would have been other people's retirement age, because he really wanted to just keep in the classroom and keep teaching undergraduates. And I sat next to him at a dinner for Martha was for our 20th or 25th reunion. But Martha Coltrap asked me to fund the dinner, and I met Walter LaFeber, who I had actually audited his class. I didn't have enough hotel credits to graduate, so I had to audit the class. But one thing led to another, and Walt became the Andrew and James Tisch Distinguished University Professor, which allowed him to teach for an extra 3 to 5 years, and it was the best investment that any one of us has ever made. But long about 2006, Walter and I were talking, and he said he was really ready to retire. I said, "How are you going to retire?" He said, "I'm going to finish my last seminar class, and then, I don't know what we're going to do exactly. We're going to stay in Ithaca." And I thought to myself, he shouldn't just retire. I mean, he shouldn't just fade away. And I thought, I would love to hear one more great lecture. I called Walt up and I said, "Walt, I'd love for you to give your last lecture as a tenured professor to your graduates, to the students you taught all these years." And he said, "Nobody will come. Nobody, and there's not a big enough market for that." I was due to have lunch with Mayo Stuntz, who's here. There he is, right there. Who's my college roommate, and we were going to have lunch in New York. And he said, "Where would you like to go to lunch?" I said, "Ithaca," because Mayo was a pilot, and so I said, let's go up and have lunch and catch one of Walt LaFeber's seminar classes. And we went up, and I convinced him that we should at least do something. If nobody shows up, we'll do it in the Cornell Club. It seats 150 people. I can paper the house easily enough, because he was convinced nobody would show up. He agreed to do the Cornell Club. And Walt's last lecture was going to be to 150 people in the Cornell Club. Inga Reichenbach, at that point, who was the head of development and very, very wise, said, "This is bigger than all that." And she convinced him, and well, maybe 350. So we booked the Olin Auditorium in Weill Cornell, which seats 350. And we sent out the invitations, and wouldn't you know it, in the first day, it was oversubscribed by 2. So we booked the Museum of Natural History IMAX Theater, seats 700. Figured we'd be okay. And the acceptances kept coming in and coming in and coming in. And finally, Inga called me up and she said, "We booked the Beacon Theater." The Beacon Theater seats 3,300. We had 3,000 people show up for Walt's last lecture, unheard of in academia. But it transported us back from the Beacon Theater to Bailey Hall or Ives or to Lincoln Hall or Stimson or Rockefeller or Ives 150, to where we spent so many great years learning and really learning from the master. But it all started with Walt saying, I'm not sure we can get 150 people. So this is the end result, and it's vintage Walt. So enjoy.
Ladies and gentlemen, please turn off your cell phones and pagers. Flash photography is not allowed. Thank you.
Welcome to the Beacon Theater. This is not the Allman Brothers concert. That was last month. And it's not the Linda Ronstadt concert. That's June. This is an academic lecture by a professor of diplomatic history. And I think it's pretty incredible to have this audience for an academic lecture by a professor of diplomatic history. But of course, it's not just any lecturer on diplomatic history. It's Walter LaFeber, who is a legend in his own time, and we could not be more delighted that we have an opportunity to hear Walt's last lecture this evening in New York City. I am delighted to tell you that Walt's wife, Sandy, is here in the audience. His daughter, Suzanne, please stand. His daughter, Suzanne, her husband, Tom, their two kids, as well as son, Scott, and his fiancée, Laura Morin. It's wonderful to have the LaFebers here. We wanted to hold this event initially in the theater of the Museum of Natural History, but then the RSVPs started coming in and coming in and coming in. We're at 3,000 people now, and there are many who were disappointed not to be able to enter this hall this evening. It is because we have a wonderful scholar, teacher, to present to you this evening, and scholarship and teaching are what Cornell is about. It is rare indeed to find them together in a single individual of such distinction. All of us know many fine teachers at the undergraduate level. We know many great scholars. It's rare to have them combined, and Walt combines them in a truly remarkable way, and he also cares tremendously about the business of teaching undergraduate students, and that's why so many of his students are here this evening. It is important to recognize as well that Andrew and James Tisch decided in the year 2002 that for Cornell, there should also be an ability for many of our professors who come towards the end of their careers to have the chance to stay on for an extra period of time to reach Cornell undergraduates, but to enable their departments nonetheless to replace them early. And so they established the Andrew H. and James S. Tisch Distinguished University Professorship. And the first holder of that position is Walt LaFeber. And I'm delighted that Walt could hold this position initially. This signifies to me a true commitment to undergraduate teaching, so much so that professors towards the end of their career can be recognized and honored on a university-wide basis and continue to teach undergraduates for additional years. It is my pleasure to introduce to you now Andrew Tisch, who will introduce our speaker. Andrew?
Good evening, and thank you, Hunter, and welcome all to this most special evening. Welcome to Bailey on Broadway. 4 years ago, when my brother Jim and I and our families created the Distinguished University Professorship, we did so with Walter LaFeber in mind, the quintessential teacher, the one who should be encouraged to keep teaching and not retire. We are thrilled that Walter chose to stay in the classroom those extra years and weave his insights into the minds of yet another generation of Cornellians. And we're equally thrilled that Walter agreed to teach all his generations together tonight. We all had great experiences at Cornell and look back fondly at our days at college as college students. We were there to learn, to expand our minds, to grow, and to grow up. And we can now appreciate the great teaching that we had at Cornell. While it's a bit unfair to say that any one professor was better than any other, there is one person who stood out across a broader cross-section of the university as a master teacher. He is a person who motivated and stimulated us. He captivated us not by his dazzling rhetoric or histrionics, but by his insights. We were in awe of his obvious command of his subject. His words flowed as if he was reciting the most eloquent of prose. In every lecture, he took us to a different time or place and made us feel as if we were part of the deepest, most important discussions in history. He expanded our minds by instilling in us the desire to want to know more. He taught us the truth lie not on the surface, but at the end of a road filled with probing, skepticism, and questions. He made us all feel smarter for having sat in his presence. And although he taught hundreds at a time, he always made himself available to each of us as individuals. And he has done this with 47 years worth of Cornell students. He has elevated the title teacher to new and uncharted levels. Fellow students, it is my honor to present Professor Walter LaFeber. Thank you.
I deeply appreciate that. This is all quite overwhelming. I'm used to 400 to 500, but not this many. I appreciate Andrew's introduction. I appreciate Hunter's introduction. I'll get back to Andrew in a minute. I want to talk a little bit about Sandy's and my honor that you have come out and that we are so fortunate in seeing a number of people we haven't seen for many, many years, and we're going to be able to see them this afternoon. I will talk a lot in the first person, but when I do, I want you to understand that Sandy should always be included as the second person, because without Sandy, I would not have been at Cornell, quite literally. When we were deciding whether to get married, Sandy asked me what I intended to do, and I said I thought I would probably go back to the family business in a small town in northern Indiana. And she said that she had grown up in a small town in southern Illinois, that she intended to live in the East, and that if I hoped to see her, I would have a long commute. So I went through what the Cornell Career Center now calls a rapid career reevaluation and decided that I would go into teaching instead. When I saw Sandy look at this audience this afternoon, a story suddenly returned to my mind that I had forgotten about. It's the story of a politician in Washington. We'll call him Howard because that was actually his name. I've heard this story secondhand, but it's so good that I'm not sure that I ever want to find out that it's not true. Howard served with distinction in Washington for 30 years. They had a going-away party for him in which a number of the most distinguished people in Washington came to the going-away party. His wife had played an extraordinarily important role in his career, extraordinarily. He was quite clear in saying that he would not have been in Washington as successful as he was if it was not for his wife. So that evening, after they had a number of very nice toasts, halfway through the evening, his wife got up to speak and said, I always knew that sometime I would be addressing an audience as distinguished and as accomplished as this. What surprises me is that Howard is here too. And I think that was what was going through Sandy's mind about an hour ago. I feel very fortunate that Hunter Rollins was here. Sandy and I were counting a while back, and we figured out that we have served under more than half of the Cornell presidents. That says something about Cornell being the youngest Ivy League institution. It also says something about how long we've been at Cornell. And we've been very, very fortunate. Dale Corson, who cannot be here this evening, but I spoke with him before we left Ithaca. He is now 91, very active, is still a fount of wisdom at Cornell, and about higher education. Dale was the person who put Cornell back together again after the trauma and the crisis of 1969, a remarkable man. The reason why many of us stayed at Cornell in the 1970s is because of Dale Corson, a person who essentially helped develop radar in World War II to win the Battle of Britain, who was at Los Alamos in 1945, who came to Cornell and developed physics department into one of the great physics departments in the world, and who also was the dean of engineering. And then in the 1960s was provost, and he happened to be provost at the same time I was chair of the history department in the late 1960s. And he was very, very kind to the history department, and I wanted to thank Dale before we came here to New York for this trip, for all he had done for the history department. He essentially, because of Dale, we doubled the number in the history department, and some of the most eminent historians in Cornell's history came because Dale supported them. Dale once heard me tell a story about a British philosopher. I think some of the people in the audience here have heard me tell this too. A man named Samuel Butler, who was at a dinner party in London in the early 19th century, and a woman asked him, why does God tolerate historians? And Butler thought for a while and said, well, you see, madam, it is because since God himself cannot change the past, he is obliged to tolerate historians who can. And Dale said to me, you know, that's the best reason, that's better than any reason you've given me for enlarging the history department. Dale has been a friend for decades now, a very valued friend. He was followed by Frank Rhodes, who, as everyone here knows, essentially transformed what Cornell was physically and in many ways intellectually. Sandy and I were very fortunate to be with Frank and Rosa when they went to Asia in the 80s and the 90s and began to re-cement ties between Cornell and Asia that go way back to Willard Strait, but back even beyond Willard Strait. Hunter Rollins gave a remarkable paper on campus a week ago about Cornell's long ties with Asia, and particularly China. And Frank essentially reestablished a lot of those relationships, and then Hunter picked those up and redeveloped them in the 1990s. But what Hunter also did was to transform the face of undergraduate education at Cornell with the North Campus and with the new houses on the West Campus. The Alice Cook House, the Hans Bethe House, the Carl Becker House. What he also did, and I want to draw your attention particularly to this because I think it is so interesting and important for Cornell and for Cornell's relationships with the world. What he also did was to listen to a Cornell graduate, class of 75, named Mike Zack. Mike Zack had the idea, after having a number of business ventures in China, that what the United States was going to need in the 21st century were a number of highly trained, professional, knowledgeable people about China. And that Cornell, particularly given its history going back to the 19th century, should be the place where this is done. Hunter picked this idea up, and then Jeff Lehman, when he was president, carried this on and negotiated a number of the arrangements in Peking. And at one point, I might add, when it looked as though the program might be coming to a dead stop, Jeff kept it going. And then this past fall, Hunter went over and negotiated the final agreements with Beida, with Beijing University. And now Cornell will, starting next year, begin to turn out essentially 20 people every year who've had between 4 and 6 years of Chinese, depending on how much they take in the Falcon program and how much they've had in high school. They will have had specialized training in China. They will have worked Cornell in Washington, which was one of the pioneering programs in Washington, of course, as many of you know. They will then spend time in Beijing, working in Chinese affairs and in American Chinese affairs. And when they graduate, they will be in a position where they can go into government service, they will go into business, they will go into NGOs. We believe this is one of the most exciting programs in Cornell's history, thanks to an alum, thanks to Hunter, thanks to Jeff. And it is a program, I think, that's going to be emulated and copied by many other universities in the United States. At least, I very much hope so. Cornell, in that sense, has been very well served by its president, and all of us now are looking to serve under David Skorton. In 1969, 1970, as I said, Dale essentially came in and helped put the university back together. But what I also remember from 1969, 1970 was something that I'd never understood about Cornell until that point. And it came home very clearly and very directly to me. And it came home one afternoon when I was in the history department office, and a man named Jack Clark walked into the office to talk about what was going on campus during the crisis of the spring of 1969. I had never laid eyes on Jack Clark before. I knew Jack Clark because he was a distinguished graduate of the engineering school at Cornell. He was of the Kimberly-Clark family. He had been the person who had pioneered the development of industrial film at Eastman Kodak. And he had given a prize for teaching at Cornell several years before. Jack Clark came on campus. I thought this was very interesting. And he began to ask questions about what had happened and what he could do to make sure that Cornell got through this all right. Jack was the first of a number of Cornell alums who came through that particular spring. I had never understood the role of Cornell alumni at Cornell until the spring of 1969, and I must say I was dazzled by it and incredibly impressed by the people and by the stature of the people who took time to come to Cornell and help Cornell through that particular crisis. Arthur Dean, Bob Purcell, a number of other people who were essentially lifesavers for Cornell and for Dale Corson at the time. 2 years later, after this, Andrew Tisch graduated from Cornell, and 4 years after that, Jim Tisch graduated. And it is one of the great honors of Sandy's in my life that we have come to know Merrill and Jim and Ann and Andrew Tisch and their mother, Billy Tisch, who is here, I'm very, very pleased to say. They are a great family, and they have done great work. When Larry Tisch died a year and a half, 2 years ago, Andrew was asked about the Tisch family being successful. And Andrew said something that I found quite remarkable. He said, the idea of success is not to think of it as an ending point. The idea of success is to think of it as a transition, as a passage to something else. And when I read that, I understood what the Tisch family was really all about. The Tisch family has certainly been successful, but what they have also done, particularly in their relationship with Larry Tisch's alma mater, NYU, it's what they have done for Columbia, what they have done for Harvard, what they have done for Cornell is quite extraordinary. And it has been a great honor to be associated with the Tisch name at Cornell. All of us at Cornell are indebted to Merrill, to Jim, to Ann, and to Andrew, and all that the Tisch family has done, not only for Cornell, but for higher education in general. The role of the alumni is something that all of us at Cornell, although we don't talk about it much, faculty talk about other things, nevertheless fully appreciate and understand. Jack Clark started the teaching program at Cornell, the teaching awards program at Cornell. There are others, the Appels, the awards given in honor of the Russells. And there is one person here today who has played a particularly important role, and that's Steve Weiss, the former chair of the Board of Trustees. Steve, who has done many things for Cornell, including bringing Hunter Rollins to Cornell. In 1995, he was instrumental in bringing Hunter to Ithaca. In the early 1990s, usual ideas were going around Ithaca, around Cornell, about how to award teaching, how to pay attention to teaching. Jim Moss, Walter Lynn in engineering, a number of people had ideas. It was Steve Weiss, essentially, who said, I'll support that, and I want to make a contribution in shaping it. And what came out of it was the Weiss Presidential Teaching Fellows, an award program that not only recognizes teachers, but because of Steve's imagination and generosity, also gives those teachers a chance to do experimental work and gives them funds to do different kinds of teaching. And several weeks ago, Steve came back to Ithaca, convened the Weiss presidential teachers, and essentially asked for their suggestions and asked what we could do in order to strengthen teaching at Cornell. I can tell you from being at many universities during the course of my career, everybody talks about how important teaching is and how it needs to be strengthened. Cornell is the one place I know, whether in the Ivy League or outside the Ivy League, who has provided this kind of resources and this kind of imagination brought by people like Jack Clark and Steve Weiss to the whole commitment of Cornell to teaching. And for that, we are very, very deeply grateful to the Tisches, to Steve, and to Clarks. There was another thing that happened in the late 1960s, early 70s, when I go back and think about a career at Cornell that was very important. Cornell has had, going back to the early part of the 20th century, a very close commitment to American diplomacy, which happens to be my field. Willard Straight, many of you know, the person after whom the center is named at Willard Straight Hall at Cornell, but Willard Straight was a very important diplomat in China between 1906 and 1911, the climax of the Chinese Revolution. Starting in the late 1960s into the 70s and the 1980s, Cornell produced a number of leading international officials. Steve Hadley, who was President Bush's National Security Advisor, was to be here this afternoon. He had to cancel out at the last minute. But we have President Clinton's National Security Advisor here, Sandy Berger, with Susan Berger. And coming out of the 60s, when Sandy graduated, Susan graduated, and Steve graduated in 1969, a whole series of people came out. Carol Kuntz, who I believe is here, Bob Einhorn, who was absolutely instrumental in 30 years of disarmament negotiation until he retired several years ago, is here. Eric Edelman, who is the number 3 person in the Defense Department now, was the ambassador to Turkey and to Finland. Dan Fried, who is he's the Assistant Secretary of State, but he's considerably higher than that in the State Department because of his background in Eastern Europe. And the person who has probably one of the toughest ambassadorial jobs right now, Bill Brownfield, who's the U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela. They all came out of Cornell, and this is only part of them, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And Cornell is very proud of these people. It is in a great Cornell tradition, as I say, going back to Willard Straight, that these people have served the United States. And in several instances, particularly Sandy's and Steve Hadley's instance, they served the President of the United States. So Cornell alumni, in a whole variety of ways, as I discovered in the late 1960s, early 1970s, are truly, truly extraordinarily people. And Sandy and I are most indebted to them for what they have meant to us personally, what they have done for the university. They've done a great deal for the university, and what they've done for the United States. When I came to Cornell in 1959, I came with 2 other people, the history department, Don Kagan, who is now a distinguished professor of history, of ancient history, and Brian Tierney, who was about 10 years older than Don and I were. Brian remains in his middle 80s one of the great figures in medieval history in the world. Don and I had been to very good graduate schools. We thought we knew a lot about history. We thought we were really well positioned to teach at Cornell. The one thing they had not explained to us, to Don and to me, when we came to Cornell, at least in our graduate school career, was what we were going to be paid. A person told me several weeks ago, who graduated from Cornell in the late 50s, that he remembers paying something like $200 a semester, maybe he said a year, at one of the colleges at Cornell. And I want to tell you, as I told him, that that was fully reflected in the faculty salaries at the time. Don and I looked at each other when we found out that we were going to be making a $4,000 a year salary. We both had families. And we suddenly discovered that we had not learned everything that we should have known about teaching from our graduate school instruction. To find out exactly what this was all about, we had to go to the eminent American philosopher, Henny Youngman. It was Henny Youngman who said that I have all the money I'll ever need, provided I die by 4 o'clock this afternoon. Don and I understood exactly what Henny Youngman was talking about. But then something happened. The next year, the chair of the department told us that we were not going to get any raises, that Cornell had a budgetary crisis, and that faculty were not getting any raises. And Don and I said, okay, we were very grateful to be at Cornell. Jobs were scarce in those days, but it would have been nice if we each had families, if we had a little bit more money. And several weeks later, we found out that we did. We got something like $500 increases, which were phenomenal. And the reason this happened was because of the dean at the time and the associate deans. And the associate deans happened to find out that Don and I had had some success in the classroom. And as a result, the deans had overruled the department and had essentially given us these $500 raises. What I learned at that point was that university presidents are certainly very important, but at the dean level, at the middle level, Cornell has been blessed in the last 45 to 50 years with extraordinary people, starting in 1960, as Don and I learned firsthand, but right on through, including the people who have helped organize this. Jeff and Carol True Palmer, Lauren. These are extraordinary people. Sue Murphy, who is here tonight, Vice President at Cornell, a person that I feel particularly strong about because she happened to be an advisee of mine when she was a history major, and it's been a pleasure to watch Susan be Dean of admissions and then rise to become vice president and one of the most important people at Cornell in the last generation. I've learned that Cornell is a great university, not only because it has distinguished faculty and because it has had distinguished leadership, but that part of that leadership has come from those middle to upper middle levels, people who know what are going on and who work extraordinarily hard in helping the university. And I want to express my thanks to those people, both for what they've done tonight and for what several of them did in increasing my salary $500 some 47 years ago. The late 1960s at Cornell and in the United States are, of course, memorable years. The events at Cornell in 1969 have been written about in a remarkable book that Don Downs, who was a sophomore at the time and is now a distinguished political scientist at the University of Wisconsin, and the book that Don Downs wrote about. What I especially remember, and I think many of the people in the audience remember, and I know Sandy Berger remembers, from Cornell in the late 1960s, is George Cahan. George Cahan was the great man in the world in Southeast Asia history and politics, and he turned out a number of people who were essentially intelligence agents who were much better, as it turned out, than some of the U.S. government's intelligence agents in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War at the time. George gave a speech in the spring of 1969 during the crisis at Cornell, which is the most eloquent speech about academic freedom I have ever encountered anywhere, up to that time or since that time. George is a remarkable man, and I had the pleasure of going through his papers several years after his death in 2000 and discovered how closely he had worked with Senator William Fulbright, Senator Frank Church, a number of people, essentially educating them about what South Asia and Southeast Asia were really all about and what the Vietnam War was really all about. And one of the things that George pointed out as he talked with the senators and with other people in Washington in the late 1960s, one of the things that George pointed out was that when the administration talked about the importance of democracy and how the elections in Vietnam represented the beginnings of democracy, how this was not true, that it was very difficult to have real democratic elections as we understood them in the United States or in Great Britain. It was very difficult to have these elections in the middle of what was essentially a civil war and a revolution. But it was at this time, and George Cahan picked it out, that there began to be a new theme in American foreign policy. Shortly after that, Richard Nixon said that the most important president in the 20th century, in Nixon's opinion, was Woodrow Wilson. He thought Wilson was more important than Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the reason why was because of Wilson's commitment to democracy. Jimmy Carter, quite unlike Nixon, who followed Nixon into the White House, said the same thing. And then in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan began to talk about democracy and self-determination, and he used that very effectively as a way of putting pressure on the Soviet Union. Until, along with our friends who put other kinds of pressure on the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991. Beginning in the late 1960s, early 70s, in other words, we began to talk about the resurgence of Woodrow Wilson and the resurgence of a belief in self-determination and the importance of expanding democracy. This was new in American foreign policy in the late 60s and early 70s. When you go back historically and you look at this, it is notable that in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s, presidents did not talk this way. They did not talk like Woodrow Wilson. They did not talk like Ronald Reagan. They talked about power. They didn't talk about democracy. Franklin D. Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson. He had watched Wilson close up between 1918 and 1920. Wilson fail, have a series of strokes, lose his political control, and essentially end in humiliation in 1920-21. And Franklin D. Roosevelt was not going to go back and essentially relive those years and use Wilsonian rhetoric, given what had happened to Wilsonian rhetoric in 1919, 1920. By the 1940s, by the time Harry Truman was president and Dean Acheson many people consider the greatest Secretary of State of the 20th century, they were essentially making fun of Wilson by this time and essentially saying that democracy is very good, but it is not a kind of thing that travels well. And they talk more in terms of straight power politics. George Kennan, the person who was the formulator of the containment doctrine, Kennan also wrote several books in which he put Wilson down and talked about the evils of moralism in American foreign policy, which he associated with Woodrow Wilson. And I found this stunning, that in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, Wilson was essentially a non-person, and all of a sudden, from the late 1960s to the present time, Wilson has become one of the great American iconic figures. Presidents ever since that time have been called Wilsonian, and in many respects, they are Wilson. There was a story in the Washington Post several weeks ago written by a distinguished columnist. And she said in this column that for 200 years, the United States has been expanding democracy. That's not quite right. That generalization does not work. The generation in the United States who knew the most about democracy and about how well it traveled was actually the founders of this country in the 1780s and the 1790s. This is the one generation in our history where the intellectuals and the politicians were the same people. That is, incidentally, my verdict on the intellectuals, not the politicians. The person who had thought very deeply about this, of course, was Thomas Jefferson, who had written about it rather eloquently in 1776. But Jefferson made a historic statement about how he thought democracy traveled in 1803 when he more than doubled the size of the United States by purchasing Louisiana. And when he had to deal with New Orleans, which was at the center of that empire, what he did was essentially set up an authoritarian military government under a close young friend of his who was a U.S. Army general. And Jefferson and his Secretary of State, James Madison, who rightly is called the father of the American Constitution, who knew more about American democracy than anybody else in that generation, said very clearly they were not going to allow people in New Orleans to essentially elect representatives. They were not going to give them the power of democracy. In other words, what Jefferson had called certain inalienable rights in 1776 were not going to be given to the people in New Orleans in 1803, 1804. And the reason for that, Jefferson said, was because these people were in no shape or form ready to handle the responsibilities of democracy. They were people who were refugees from Mexico. They were criminals from New York City, including the famous Livingston family, some of whom got in trouble in New York City and moved down to New Orleans. They were people Jefferson did not trust. And as a result, he said, we will not give them democracy until a number of other Americans, that is, people from the American states, move into New Orleans, and they can then institute a Republican democratic government. That's exactly what happened in New Orleans. And about the time this happened, about the time that New Orleans and Lower Louisiana became a territory, John Quincy Adams had to face the same kind of question. Whether or not you would recognize the possibility that Latin Americans would be democratic, and whether the United States could help Latin Americans be democratic. John Quincy Adams is considered by historians and political scientists as the greatest Secretary of State in American history. And I would agree with that assessment. But when Adams had to decide whether or not the United States should be involved in the expansion of democracy to Latin America, he said absolutely not. That the people in Latin America came from a much different background, had a much different political context, had a much different religious belief, and he did not believe that American democracy traveled to Latin America. Now, I point these out not only to say that the Washington Post story of several weeks ago is questionable, But to note that throughout the 18th and 19th century, when American government was run by people who had thought very deeply about these issues of expanding democracy, essentially came to the conclusion that they were not sure that it traveled very well, that the form of government that the United States had was very well adapted to the United States. Whether it would be adapted even to people as close as Latin America was something they either were not sure about or they believed could not happen. And then everything changed. And it changed with, as Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter said, it changed with Woodrow Wilson. When Wilson became president in 1913, he came to office. He had a very interesting comment when he came to office. He said, it would be a great irony of my presidency if I had to concern myself heavily with foreign policy. He had been an American political scientist, but he had not known much about American international relations. In fact, when you go back and read what he says about American international relations, when he is a lecturer in the 1890s or before he becomes president of Princeton, it's rather embarrassing because he didn't know a lot about them, and it seems as though he didn't care a lot about them. He had not traveled much beyond the Caribbean. And he was not interested in them. He was interested in being a strong president, but mostly in carrying out progressive reforms at home. But of course, the irony struck. And the first thing that Wilson had to deal with was the Mexican Revolution, one of the first great 20th century revolutions, to be followed almost immediately by the Russian and the Chinese Revolution during Wilson's presidency. When Wilson began to deal with Mexico in 1913-1914, as Mexico moved towards chaos, what Wilson said was that what Mexico should do is to conduct elections. In Wilson's famous phrase, I am going to teach South Americans to elect good men. And he set out to do that in Mexico. He did not have much success. And indeed, by 1914, he used an episode off Veracruz essentially to land U.S. troops in Mexico to try to put pressure on the Mexican government. That didn't work. In 1916, he sent General Pershing in with 6,000 troops, in part because Mexicans had attacked across the New Mexico border, but this was also another form of pressure which Wilson was putting on Mexico. And the end result of Wilson trying to teach Mexico how to elect good men, as he put it in his famous phrase, essentially was a Mexican revolution that moved very rapidly to the left. And that by 1917, indeed, the Carranza government in Mexico had begun to formulate a new constitution, which did something that the British and the American governments hoped would never happen. The British and the American governments depended very heavily on Mexican oil, especially for the new ships that they were beginning to build during World War I. And what the Mexican government did in 1916 and 17 was for the first time take over all of the subsoil rights in Mexico. But it got worse. On the eve of the American entry into World War I, the Zimmerman Note was revealed by British Foreign Office. What the Zimmerman Note was a note sent from Berlin to Mexico City asking the Mexican government to come in the war on the side of Germany against the United States. And if Mexico would do this, Germany would help them after the war to regain what the United States had taken from Mexico in 1848 in the Mexican War. That is to say, most of southwest United States and California. The Mexican government immediately dismissed this, and the Wilson government said it was never serious. Years later, we found out that the initiative in this was not taken by Zimmerman and the German Foreign Office. The initiative in that was taken by the Carranza government in Mexico, who in 1916 feared that Wilson was going to invade Mexico and essentially approached Germany for help. By 1917, the crisis had passed, thank God, and a major possible crisis in U.S.-Mexican relations had passed. But Wilson's first experience in Wilsonianism and the expansion of democracy, as the Washington Post called it several weeks ago, was not only a failure, it was almost a diplomatic and military crisis. But no more had that passed than the United States entered World War I, and Wilson went before the United States Congress and uttered his famous phrase that we must make the world safe for democracy. This was the new commitment by the United States. Wilson formulated it, and that is why Wilson has been so important in American foreign policy in the last 40 years. What he said in 1917 and 1918. By 1918, his push for democracy took on new sharpness, and the reason for this was the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution that erupted in late 1917, a Russian Revolution that erupted just as several of the great empires in the world that had essentially held Europe and parts of the Middle East together for more than a century, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Turkish Empire, the German Empire, these empires began to collapse. So the question was, who would reorganize these empires? Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution had a response, and the response was essentially revolution, the end of private property. Wilson had another response, which was democracy. And on the right, there was a third response offered by the British and the French, and to a certain extent the Italians, which was a policy of colonialism, a policy of a different empire, a British or a French or an Italian empire. But it was Wilson who essentially articulated the hopes of millions and millions of people. And he was welcomed to Europe after that war in the early part of 1919 as a savior, because he had articulated this idea of democracy being the way the world would be put back together. It would not be the right or the left. It would be the American center. There was one person in the American government who had questions about this, and it happened to be Wilson's Secretary of State, a man named Robert Lansing. Lansing was a New York City Wall Street lawyer, a person who was deeply versed in Europe, who knew about European politics, a person who was an uncle of John Foster Dulles, who first made his appearance in American diplomacy at this time in 1918 and 1919. When Lansing heard Wilson talk about democracy, he wrote a very interesting passage in a letter in which he said, "I do not believe the president understands that this is dynamite. I do not believe he is clear in his own mind about whether he means that this is democracy on a territory, it is a democracy to be determined along racial lines, it is a democracy to be determined by a community. I do not think he has thought any of this out. And as a result," he said, "I think there could be an explosion." Lansing was right. Wilson had not thought this out. He had been an American political scientist, and in one of his speeches to Congress, he said, "I will enunciate American principles, I can do no other," and self-determination and the tradition of elections in the American sense was what Wilson was talking about. But by 1918 and 1919, when you begin to talk about elections in places like the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the collapsing Turkish Empire, in the Middle East as we know it right now, this was a very different kind of thing, and Lansing did not believe that Wilson would be able to ever use this particular principle that had begun to unite the world and put Wilson at the center of it, that he'd ever be able to translate that principle into effective diplomacy, and he was not. When he went to Paris, he was greeted as the savior and very quickly ran into a whole series of difficulties. One of those difficulties involved the region, what is now Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. The British and the French, in particular the British, were determined that they were going to have Iraq. And the reason why they were going to have Iraq as a colony, essentially, was because they knew that Iraq had a lot of oil. They approached Wilson about this, and instead of talking about self-determination, Wilson essentially allowed the British to go ahead to cut a deal with the French to take over Iraq and to draw the boundaries of Iraq pretty closely to where they are right now. Wilson was unable to translate the idea of American democracy in the Middle East, nor was he able to translate it very effectively in parts of even Eastern Europe. There was an election in a place like Hungary, but Hungary returned a communist candidate. And at that point, Herbert Hoover, a young progressive who was very close to Wilson, went in and with the control of food, which he, Hoover, and the United States had, essentially overthrew the communist, the communist candidate and brought in one that was more amenable to the French, the British, and to the United States. In Austria, again, Hoover used food to make sure that the elections in Austria turned out correctly. And as Lansing looked at this, Lansing essentially said to himself, "I told you so," that this is an extremely dangerous idea of expanding democracy. The people who began to be enthusiastic about Wilson in 1916, 1917, 1918 were young American liberals. One of them was a man named Raymond Robbins, who was the head of the American Red Cross in Russia. Robbins knew Wilson, and he had been a supporter of Wilson. But after he watched Wilson in Mexico, and then he watched Wilson in the Middle East, and then he watched Wilson and Hoover in Eastern Europe, Raymond Robbins passed judgment on Wilson, which I think is quite accurate. He said that what Wilson never understood was that with luck you can help people, but Wilson never understood they had to save themselves. And that seemed to be the situation in 1918, 1919. The people who took this hardest were some young liberals on the Wilson delegation who went to France with him, a number of rather distinguished historians in later years, including Samuel Eliot Morison, who was a young liberal who went with Wilson to Paris. But this group was led by a mainline Philadelphian, the handsome and quite wealthy William Christian Bullitt. Bullitt was 28 years old when he came to Washington in 1917 to help Woodrow Wilson and Lansing and others somehow try to liberalize what was left from World War I. Bullitt went to Wilson and tried to convince Wilson that one of the things Wilson should do is to talk to Lenin. Wilson sent Bullitt to talk to Lenin, and Bullitt came back from the conversations believing that there was a possibility for Wilson and Lenin to sit down and to begin to work things out. Wilson did not agree with this, would not see Bullitt when he came back, and began to make the deals that Bullitt watched in the Middle East with Japan as Japan took over parts of China and parts of the German Empire, and Wilson went along with it. And by the early part of June of 1919, Wilson, Samuel Eliot Morison, and a number of the young liberal idealists who had gone with Wilson to make the world safe for democracy and to export democracy to the remains of Europe after World War I, resigned. Early June, Bullitt signed out of the Cleon Hotel, and as he walked out the door, some journalists asked him exactly what was going on, and Bullitt said, "We've resigned. All the young liberals have resigned and have left Wilson." That Wilson had not made the world safe for democracy. He had not understood how democracy travels or does not travel. He had not understood how he would have to compromise. He had not understood the difficulties of planting democracy in certain parts of the world. He had not understood how important it was that he not agree to the Japanese taking over parts of China, but he said we knew he had to do it, otherwise Japan would not have joined the League of Nations, but we believe he did the wrong thing. And some of us are going to go back to Washington and oppose what we have tried to create here and we have not created. Bullitt walked on out the door and got into a cab to go to the train station in Paris. And one reporter asked Bullitt, "Now, Mr. Bullitt, what are you going to do?" And Bullitt said, "I'm going to lie in the sands of the Riviera and watch the world go to hell." He went, and it did. Thank you for the last 46 years. I appreciate them.
Thank you, Walter. All you did was to take the most difficult problem confronting America today and give us a history lesson on it that we'll never forget. A number of you have taken advantage of the website that we offer to send in tributes to Walt and to Sandy. Others of you have submitted anecdotes about your time in the classroom with Professor LaFeber. I'm pleased to say that we're going to keep that website open for another month for those of you who would now like to contribute who have not done so before. But I have in my hand a book of the tributes that have so far arrived, and it is with great pleasure that I present it to Walt LaFeber for his memories of wonderful, wonderful years at Cornell University. Thank you, Walt.
Thank you. Very nice.
That was really terrific.
I'll make this very brief. Sandy and I greatly appreciate this. We talk about the wonderful memories at Cornell and the wonderful people and the wonderful friends we've had over the last 47 years. But you know, a historian needs footnotes. I've got the footnotes. Thank you very much.
I was there, as many of you were, in the Beacon 17 years ago, and I still get goosebumps when I see this. It's like taking a time machine back to a century long ago and far away, and yet not that far away. So the plan for the rest of the evening is that we've got some time here for people to do some reminiscing. We've got a busy weekend ahead. There's going to be a series of panels tomorrow looking at Walt's books and how they affected the profession and the discipline. And then on Sunday, we're lucky enough to have with us many folks that went off not into the ivory tower, but off into the world of policy and business and finance. And they're going to be sharing their reminiscences as well. But this is an opportunity, I think, for those of you who have memories of Walt or reminiscing that you want to do it this evening. We're live streaming this evening, and it's also being recorded, so there will be some permanent record of what goes on here. What I thought we could do is to have people kind of line up, and if they've got reminiscences that they want to share, they can do so. I would ask that when you do get a chance to grab a hold of one of these mics, which I'm told are on either side of the podium, I think, to identify yourself, who you are and what your affiliation with Cornell is. And then, if possible, speak directly into the microphone. I'm bad at that. Like Rich, I've got altitude problems. Sometimes the microphone is higher than I am. So do speak directly into the microphone so that people can hear. And if possible, keep your remarks relatively brief, 3 or 4 minutes, because I suspect there are a number of people who have memories that they want to share. So without further ado, I think what I would do is throw the floor open. Looking quickly around the room, I see there's a person back here with a microphone who can bring it to you as you need to. But who wants to, and there are 2 of them, wow, okay, on both sides, left and right. Walt would approve. Are there folks who have memories that they want to share? And please do identify yourself before you speak.
I was waving to a friend.
No, sorry.
Oh, come on, somebody must have great stories to tell. We've got right back here, right in front.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Gilman, and I graduated in 1970 with a degree in government. I also audited LaFeber's class, and his closing at the Beacon Theater in 2006 reminds me that he used the same closing for that particular portion of the class ending right after World War I. And I say that not to say that he just recycled things, but rather to recall that both in 2006 and in more recent years, I have a feeling that Bullitt's comments about how democracy and the idealism that we grappled with is still a troublesome project in the world we live in.
How true. Other reminiscences.
I'll reminisce from a point of view. I'm Jeff Weiss. I'm in the class of '79, and Sandy. So when I was 17 years old, and Cornell had a freshman writing requirement, and I looked at the syllabus, and the only person whose name I vaguely knew from growing up outside of Chicago was Walter LaFeber. I figured that's what I should sign up for. And then I discovered freshman orientation week that you couldn't sign up for, I didn't know this, that one couldn't sign up for Walter LaFeber's course, you had to be interviewed. And the interview was in the morning after an incredible time on the, late night party, right? So this was somewhat intentional, and we all queued those who were choosing to interview in Uris Library, and you had to be qualified to interview, and somehow 12 of us got into the course, right? So we were the lucky 12 who were in the freshman writing course, and at least from my point of view, I thought I knew from high school outside of Chicago how to write. I thought I knew how to write. And I got back my papers all the time, and there was more written on them by Walt than there was that I had typed, because we typed in those days. So that was remarkable. 2 other things. So I had the privilege of spending 6 of my 8 semesters with Professor LaFeber, which for me personally was transformative and extraordinary. As those of you who knew him and had his class knew, as he wrote through different eras of history, books that he was researching, he used the students to do some of the research for him, right? So I happened to have a year with him when he was studying the post-World War II period, right? And in studying the post-World War II period, there was a big focus on containment and then on the NSC 68 document and the origins of it and all this. So that was a fascinating thing to go very deep in, which I'd be happy to talk to anybody about. The final topic, the final reminiscence I'll have, the next, is all professors give you a exam, and they get to ask the questions that they want. And the students in this case thought they knew the topic, which in this particular course at this particular moment was, give or take, American foreign policy from 1820 to 1860. So we had all studied all that, and there's some major things that go on in those periods of time in American foreign policy. The question he asked was, tell the most important thing that happened in 1839. Well, that's a really specific, and we can talk at cocktails about what happened in 1839. That's not the highlight year of that block of time. It's just not the highlight year. But Sandy, thank you for having us to your home. Thank you for, when I was 17 and 18 years old, having us to dinner and making us feel welcome. And thank you to the LaFeber family so much.
My name is Tom Downey, and I'm a graduate of the Cornell School of Industrial Labor Relations in 1970. And as a student, I thought I actually knew history, but I'd realized that I had been studying it in black and white because the first time I heard Professor LaFeber, I realized that there was a lot more color, subtlety, and nuance to American history than, certainly foreign policy, than I had studied before. I never went to McGraw Hall to see him because to me he was like an Olympic god, and I didn't think that I ever had an opportunity to say anything or ask him a question that would be worthy of his time. 5 years after I graduated, I got elected to the House of Representatives from the 2nd District of New York. And then I realized that I had an amazing resource on American foreign policy that I could ask and utilize as I dealt with matters big and small. He gave me the great honor of teaching one of his classes in Ives in 1980. And the students really came prepared for me. 1980 was a year, not that any of you probably remember this, that Jimmy Carter's foreign policy dealt with Russia. We had a grain embargo, and we decided to forego the 1980 Olympics. And the kids really learned all about my prior record and the things that I had done, and they gave me a hard time. I defended the embargo, and I defended the idea of our not participating in the Olympics. And I did not get a standing ovation. I got some tepid applause. But in one magical moment, this great man turned to me and said, "You're doing A work down there, Tom." And I said, "That's good for you to tell me now because I took the course pass-fail." A number of years later, I had the opportunity to get involved in our policies with respect to Central America. And in 1983, Walt had written a book called Inevitable Revolutions, which I read and I reread just a couple of weeks ago. I was so moved by this that I bought 40 copies of the book myself, and I distributed it to my colleagues, most of whom never read the book. But one of them did. And on the floor, Lee Hamilton, who was a senior member of the Congress and a very important member, said to me, "You know, I read that book you gave me. That is the best thing I have ever seen on Central America." And this meeting that you're having, or this remembrance that we're doing, comes at an especially delicate time in American foreign policy and in American history. And I'm really sad that Walt LaFeber isn't here to help us think through all these problems. It's hard to imagine that we continue to have the mass shootings that we do and the Congress does nothing. We were 20 days without a speaker of the House of Representatives. While I am a great and close friend of our president's and think he's doing a good job, it really requires a lot more thought to convince the American people that we are at an inflection point in our history, and it would be sure nice to have Walter LaFeber to help us think it through.
if it's okay with everybody, I'm going to come over here so that the minimum number of people have to swivel around in order to hear what I have to say. I'm David Green, and I have the signal honor of having been Walt's first PhD. Indeed, well, that's for which I claim no credit. That's simply a chronological accident. But I believe I am also the only Cornell student who did both my undergraduate honors thesis and my doctoral dissertation under Walt's supervision. So Walt and I go back a very long time. This isn't really a story about me, it's a story about Walt, as it should properly be, but because I happened to be there, it was a series of interactions between us. When I finished my undergraduate degree in 1962, at Walt's initiative and with Walt's support, I was awarded a Woodrow Wilson Foundationship fellowship to go to Stanford and study with Professor Tom Bailey, as Walt himself had done in his time. So I went up to Walt's office, which was then in West Sibley Hall, to thank him and to say goodbye. And we sat and we talked for a while, and all of a sudden I said, I don't know any history. And Walt just smiled and said, that's all right. Wait till you get to graduate school. You'll have lots of time. So off I went to graduate school. And as it turned out, I followed in Walt's footsteps a second time because, as many of you know, Walt did not stay at Stanford for his doctorate. He left Stanford and Tom Bailey after 1 year, took an MA, and he wound up doing his doctoral work with Fred Harrington and Bill Williams at Wisconsin. Well, as it turned out, I didn't follow his footsteps in that respect. Rather, what happened was, at Walt's invitation, I came back to Cornell and did my PhD with him. I finished in June of '67, and again, with his support and encouragement, I was hired on to teach at Ohio State. So I went up to Walt's office, which in those days was still in West Sibley Hall, to say goodbye and to thank him, and we talked for a while, and then I suddenly said, I don't know any history. And Walt just smiled and said, that's all right. Wait till you start teaching. You'll have lots of time. And off I went to teach at Ohio State. 2 years later, again with Walt's encouragement, he brought me back to teach summer session at Cornell in the department prior to taking up my new position in Western Canada at the University of Saskatchewan. And Walt, being the consummate mentor that he was, since he wasn't teaching summer session, he offered me the use of his office to teach the summer session class, which I gratefully accepted. So I taught summer session of 1969. And on the very last day, having entered all the grades, I was packing up my books to leave, and suddenly, through the open door, in walked Walt. So I immediately got up to offer him his chair. No, he wasn't having it. I was now sitting where he always sat. He was sitting where I always sat. And we talked for a while, and all of a sudden I said, I don't know any history. And Walt just grinned and said, that's all right. Wait till you retire. You'll have all the time in the world. The coda to the story is, more than half a century later, I'm still teaching summer session in the history department at Cornell. And I often think to myself, I don't know any history. And I can hear Walt looking at me and grinning and say, "What do you expect? You haven't retired yet."
You're going to force me to tell my, oh, there's one here, yes.
I'll follow your example and stand where I can see you all. My name is Bob Einhorn. I'm class of 69. And I'm prompted to take the microphone because of Jeff's recollection of the exam he took. I have a different recollection, and I really want to ask all of you whether you share mine. I remember the several exams we used to have in his diplomatic history lecture course. And the idea was several days before the exam, you got, I think it was 5 essay questions. And you were told to, go home, go to your dorm, confer with your classmates, work together, and prepare, prepare essays for all of those 5. And we did, and we, collaborated, and we stayed up all night, and we did all of those things. And then you got to, in those days, it was Goldwyn Smith Hall, and Walt would come up on the chalkboard. He'd write, 2, 4, 5, 1, 3, 4, or something like that. And you'd know these are the questions. You took out your little blue exam book. And you started scribbling like mad, and recalling as much as you could of all the of all the preparation you'd done over the last 3 or 4 sleepless nights. And I asked myself, at first, why is he doing this? He's allowing us to work with our friends and compare notes and do all of this stuff. And then after going through several cycles of this, I realized he wasn't really interested in giving us grades. He felt he constructed these 5 questions so skillfully that if you were conscientious about it and really thought about the answers, you will have pulled together, you will have synthesized really what he was trying to do over the last however many, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever. It was one of the best, I've thought about this a lot since. And in no course I took at graduate school or no exam as an undergraduate was it so successful in really helping me learn. It was a great, great learning experience. And I think it was part of Walt's genius that it was able to construct exams this way. Anyway, that's my recollection. I don't know how many of you shared that.
Well, there were several of us present here this evening who were on the other side of that doing the grading. I mean, Walt did check in, and I can see over at the, we call this the LaFeber posse table. This is where the folks who've been involved in putting together the tribute are sitting. Looks like Lorena and a couple of others may have.
He came up with a question.
Okay, well, then you need to identify yourself, Lorena, and elaborate so that Bob Einhorn can one's coming up right behind you.
We came up with the questions. It was part of the training. And it was hard. It was hard. So, and then we would all come in with 3 or 4 questions, and then it would pick amongst the best. And you were either chosen or not. So, I mean, here we are popping bubbles. But he was, yeah. Everyone was learning all the time. That's all.
Yeah. This is Lorena.
So we were, the 3 of us were
among the last graduates.
Right, and most of us at this table were his last graduate students. But we did the first pass of grading those exams, and then we would meet with him in his office And he nearly always, those of you who are undergraduates will be pleased to know, were arguing that we had been too harsh and we should raise your grades. So that was our experience. I don't know if that was the experience earlier in his career, but he was always trying to say, can't you find a few more points for this student or that student? So.
I think it was always that way. That was Ann Foster and Lorena Opeza for the people who were streaming in. Other, yes.
Sure, I'll come up over here. My name is Jeff Bialos. I'm class of 77, and I guess I sort of more or less majored in Walt. I think I had about 24 credits with Walt LaFeber. And I, too, was in the freshman seminar, and ours was on foreign policy and presidential power. And I'll never forget the very last class was at Sandy and Walt's house, and I think your daughter was young then and was there, and it was in April 29th, I looked it up actually, 1974. And I know that because we watched on TV that night as President Nixon agreed to give up the tapes, the set of the transcripts. They had a big pile of transcripts piled on the table, and it was really a bookend of an era, if you will, on Walt. And the theme of the course was the imperial presidency, and it had Art Schlesinger's book, and the end of the course was in that summer in '74. I'm a lawyer, by the way, as well, and I've been in government service. The Supreme Court ruled and required Nixon to give up the rest of the tapes that August, and that led to the resignation, et cetera. So I'll never forget your graciousness that night, Sandy, at the house, and that event, because it was really quite memorable. And just to go on a little bit, in that seminar, I wrote a paper on the Hungarian Revolution, and Walt encouraged me to apply under FOIA for documents, and we got hundreds of them a year later. And so he encouraged me to write my thesis with him, which I did, and he was instrumental in me getting a traveling fellowship. And I went and spent a month or so in Abilene, Kansas, at the Eisenhower Library in the summer of 1976 to write this thesis. And there were 4 or 5 grad students there from all over, and soon, there weren't many people at the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. You could
there still aren't.
Right? Right. It was a mile from the hotel. I had to walk. There was no way to get there. Anyway, they quickly realized that I was who I told them I was, and I knew Walt. And so immediately, this became a major thing. And every night at dinner, they wanted to hear stories of Walt, okay? And I really didn't appreciate the breadth and depth of how important he was in the profession until then. And toward the end of that trip, this is kind of embarrassing, my mother wired me with my law board score, and I went and I told them I was going to law school, and they all told me I was a traitor. And how could I not stay and study and be a PhD candidate at Cornell with Walt, who, by the way, did encourage me to go to law school and grad school. And one last story, which I think you'll appreciate, and there's a few other faculty involved in this. Similarly, in 1975, Vice President Key came and spoke at Cornell. And this was not a good scene. He was booed off the stage at Bailey Hall. And so the university decided that they wanted to do something different, and they had a report that said, let's have a panel of faculty for the next such speech, which was in March 29th, 1976. Sorry, I looked this up again. And it was William Colby, who was the former director of the CIA. Now, I was an intrepid young editor and reporter on the Cornell Daily Sun at the time, and decided I should check into this, and I did. And it turned out that a who's who of the Cornell faculty refused to sit on the panel. Now, I knew this was sort of a very tricky story, because while we were the fourth establishment and the Sun was independent, I was a student. And I went to Walt for advice. And by the way, Walt was one of the people who couldn't do it, but he had a legitimate excuse, unlike most of the others. He had some prior commitment. But I went, and Walt told me I had to write that story, that it was an important story, that democracy on campus was very important. And just to finish it, and then I'll shut up, so he told me to go see all these folk, and I went and I met with Dick Pollenberg, who was very annoyed with me at the time, wrote a letter to the editor and said the editor doesn't know, the writer doesn't know the difference between the word declined to sit on the panel and refused to sit on the panel. Walt had a few things to say about that. I'll spare you that. But my favorite part was Ted Lowy I went to see. Now, Ted told me he would only talk to me during his office hours. So I went, and there was a line of graduate students there, and I had to sit through this for a while. And finally it got to my turn, and Ted basically used me as his lecturer, and he basically said, you're just a tool of the corrupt establishment here today, you realize. You're here and no other guys, but you should just resign and confess your error. Anyway, I was a tool and a traitor in the same year, and I thank Walt for that.
Yeah. Looks like we've got Eric Edelman over in the, or Eric Alterman over in the corner. Yeah, okay, yes. No comment. Sorry about that.
Hi, I'm Eric Alterman. I graduated from Cornell in 1982. I went to Cornell in part because I had this great American history AP class in high school, and it was team taught by one teacher taking the liberal position on everything and the other teacher taking the conservative position. And the conservative, the man playing the conservative was a great teacher, and he was a little bit conservative, but he fixed on this Walter LaFeber professor as the communist who had to be argued with in theory. He followed his work very carefully so that he could put it down. And I said, well, I'm going to go and study with this guy because I'm a communist too. And I did. And I could tell you a lot of stories, but we became very close. He blurbed my first book, which came out in 1992, and he blurbed my second to last book, which came out 3 years ago. And I was very proud of that because I'm not the historian that he was. But there's two things I want to say that I learned from him that are tangential to the substance that I learned from him, which is, of course, enormous. The first thing was somewhat similar to the story that we just heard. When Walt was writing Inevitable Revolutions, that's when I was studying with him in the seminar, and the ambassador from El Salvador had been invited to speak at Cornell. And this was when we were all protesting Ronald Reagan's policies in Central America, quite appropriately. And he came to speak, and he kept getting shouted down, and the protesters and students wouldn't let him finish. And Walt took the stage and insisted that everybody be quiet. The only other time I ever saw this happen at Cornell was when Bruce Springsteen played at Cornell, and he told people to be quiet, and they did. And people did be quiet. And the thing was, Walt, if you read Inevitable Revolutions, it was sort of on the side of the communists. I'm not saying he was a communist, but the Marxists, had the better part of the argument in those days. And it's very clear from Inevitable Revolutions if you read that. And yet he cared much more about civil discourse. And the idea of allowing people to be heard, the idea of free inquiry in university, which I think is today more important than anything and more under threat. Along those same lines, I don't know if anybody's mentioned this. I was at the Beacon Theater, so I didn't feel I need to watch it again. I got a master's at Yale after I went to Cornell, and I studied a little bit with Donald Kagan, who was very conservative, one of the most conservative historians in America. And he told me the story. Am I repeating anything that's been said? No. So he told me the story of during the takeover of the Willard Strait in 1968. Kagan was so horrified by what he saw as the administration's capitulation that he just left town and never wanted to come back. And then Walt, who was chairman of the history department at the time, and a bit of a communist by these definitions, resigned his post as chairman of the department. And so Kagan turned around and drove back to Ithaca, because he says, if that's the kind of man I'm working with, a man who fundamentally disagrees with me on everything, but stands up for civil discourse in free inquiry in university. That's the kind of department I want to be a part of. So I think those two lessons are lessons that all, particularly today, academics can take heed of. I could say a lot of other things, but I think those are the most relevant things and things that could get lost in just focusing on his scholarship and what a great guy he was personally.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think we've got Rich Immerman here. Richard Immerman.
Yeah, I just want to add a little footnote to that, but sort of broaden it. It touches on a number of the bases that people have been saying. So I was one of those people in 1969 and 1970 who actually had to talk to Walt and wanted him to strike because I was striking against the Vietnam War, and I was struggling to sort of figure out where I was supposed to be on campus and what was supposed to be going on. I keep joking that I would have, Frank Castigliola would have been my TA, except that Walt had sections as optional, and I had a war to end, so I never went to section. So I didn't get to know Frank really until after we were both gone. But there was another side of the academic freedom, and I just sort of want to talk about what Cornell was like at that point, because in 1969 and 1970, 1971, and it had to do with when the discussion of the course in the imperial presidency, I was taking courses with Walter LaFeber, with George Cahan, with Clinton Rossiter. I was listening to debates between Werner Dannhauser and Dan Berrigan, in which nobody said, sit down, on either side. And afterward, we would all sort of gather at the Temple of Zeus. Some of you might have remember the Temple of Zeus when it was not the Temple of Zeus of today, when it was the good Temple of Zeus. And we would discuss sort of these issues. It was an incredibly exciting, fertile, intellectual period of time that later, and I was writing Sandy about this, that I spoke to Walt about, and with all of the troubles he had, he missed that sort of academic energy that was something about Cornell that promoted it, and the spectrum of different professors, whether it was, you talk about the Kagans on one side, and I mean, I remember having a conversation with Clinton Rossiter in the Strait, during that time, and it was not long before he took his life. And, he was the epitome of the advocate of the imperial presidency. At the same time, I was learning from Walt about all the problems that James K. Polk and others did in terms of mimicking setting the thing for the imperial presidency.
Thomas Hampson, the baritone opera, to be part of his Branding in the Arts course that I support. And we're working on a project involving a show he wanted to put on. He'd done this one-off, and he wanted to put on a show of like these historic songs of American history, operatic kind of, and some of the composers of the songs were much more famous for other things they'd done in history. And as I was talking with Thomas in the course, we were doing back and forth about ideas, it reminded me of Walt, the way he taught that course, in which he would take not non-famous people from American history, but lesser known, right? It tells about the origin of American history through, more someone like Hamilton than Jefferson or Washington or something. And I can't remember all the figures. Willard Straight is the one that I remember best. And so 25 odd years later from taking the class, I emailed him, right, as an emeritus, and got his email. And of course, he delightfully, as many of you have probably had these small experiences with him, reply. And I had told him about this project, and it reminded me of this class. And he was like, wow, I never even thought of it that way. I never thought about my class as being like that, despite, of course, to my memory, him saying exactly that was going to be the part of how he was going to teach. His rubric was going to be to bring his story to life through these lesser figures. So, wonderful that even later in his life he could do that. Two other little moments. Clinton Rosser, my grandfather, was a professor of art and architecture at Cornell, overlapped. I may have even taken his class. I cannot remember for sure. When I asked my grandfather for recommendations of who I should be taking classes from when I was there. But he was close friends with Clinton Rossiter, whose name who came up, and talking about American history and the takeover of Willard Straight and the suicide in my family. It broke him. I mean, he was seeing this sort of, for him, this cascade of crisis of democracy. I'm not talking too much about it now, Congressman aside, bringing up a little bit of it, but I was thinking about that this evening as well, of how he mentioned in the lecture Cornell coming back after that, and it was not easy for many of the people who were there, students and faculty. So, and then last thing, I ended up getting involved in foreign policy after I graduated. He was an inspiration. I went to Washington, D.C. when I graduated, ended up working for, quote unquote, the other side. I ended up working for the Australian embassy in Washington, D.C. So, an ally, not totally the other side. But there's a lot of, magic in the way he talks about history and foreign policy, and that's what I was doing, representing this relationship, on a very small scale between the U.S. and Australia. And what you didn't get from being in the classroom was the reality of the massive amounts of time for what amounted to very simple things. The biggest thing I did in my decade of working at the Australian embassy was basically recommending a handshake between the Secretary of Energy and the head of energy, the Minister of Energy at of Australia, to get a thing done involving nuclear research reactor, foreign spent fuel return. And 3 years of effort, a 7-page environmental impact statement, supplement, blah, blah, blah. The true foreign policy was a moment in the side of a meeting with a handshake, and that's how most of it all worked. And it sort of, remember in that moment of having the recommendation and having that happen, thinking about him and how he brought so much to life of what was really a very simple thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody want to have the last word? Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. Here.
Thank you. My name is David Mazel, and I'm the class of 1968. So with a few exceptions, I've known Walt and his family for 5.5 decades or whatever. When I was first admitted to Cornell in 1964, the old Cornell Club, which is on 50th Street in a hotel on the 3rd floor, used to, and I've told the story, so I apologize to some of the people, used to have a little meet and greet in May. And so I traveled in from Brooklyn, and a couple of students, and there was a history student then, an honors student named Richard Cutler. And he was 2 years ahead of me, but he lived in my neighborhood. And we talked, and I said I was Cornell, etc. And he just said to me, he said, you know, there's this young hot shit at Cornell that you really have to get to know, okay? So I come up to Cornell, and my freshman advisor, who I was assigned, was a man named Knight Biggerstaff. And elderly, no real connection with younger people. And after first semester, I wandered into Mrs. Menke's office, and she was the longtime secretary in the history department. And I said, Mrs. Menke, I was wondering if I could have Professor LaFeber as my advisor. She said, sure, fine. And later I learned that Knight Biggerstaff had played a very important role in discussions between Mao and Chiang in China. And he never really, I'm just talking about a Biggerstaff because Sherm has told me that Biggerstaff never really talked about it, never really kept his notes, unfortunately. So let me digress with Walter, and I kind of say, well, what kind of a man was Walter? I was never a very good language student, so that in my sophomore year, when I went up to his office on the 3rd floor, he would very patiently listen to me moan and groan about my terrible experience in French. And then finally he said, well, I wasn't a particularly good student either, but my teacher was Mademoiselle Anderson, and she happened to like basketball players. So it was a little bit easier for me as far as that's concerned. However, having 12 or 9 or 12 credits of C or C minus did not exactly help my academic record over there. I would say that Walt was very focused on the undergraduate education. He liked talking with people. Over the years, I didn't have the academic depth, let's phrase it this way, of many of the people here. And to me, the relationship that I developed with Walt, with Sandy, the people, Walt was a pal, back and forth. And we spent, and I would not bait him, I would write him letters, I would ask him some questions, whether it would be about new books, sports, politics, particularly some of the things at Cornell. Fortunately, I had gotten to know many of the senior trustees, whether it was Austin Kiplinger, Weiss, on there. And so we would banter back and forth and on this. And Walt would always, for some reason, take my questions when I would write him, and he would write back 2 or 3 page extended discussions. I later find out through Frank and et cetera that the 200 or 300 letters that I have from him were quite valuable in terms of a discussion from a historical point of view, and I guess they're used in some of these issues. One small vignette that I remember, Walt was very understated, and the only time he once said to me he was a little nervous, I think was the way he phrased it. Maybe it was in 1962, 61 or 62. He had a luncheon, and he found out that he was sitting next to Arthur Dean. Now, Arthur, as he explained to me, this is Walter explained to me, Arthur Dean grew up in Ithaca, New York, attended Ithaca High School, went to Cornell as an undergraduate, got his graduate degree there. Early on, maybe 1923, he started working at Sullivan and Cromwell, worked with Mr. John Foster Dulles, and Dean was very instrumental, I think, in certain issues, whether it was in the Korean War, in the negotiating and talking about the peace, or I think the nuclear test ban, etc. It's fair to say that his worldview and politics were somewhat different than Walter's, okay? So Walter said, so I'm going to be sitting next to him at the lunch. And we sit down, and Dean turns to him and says, so you're the young guy that I'm supposed to get to know and talk about. And I said, well, how did the lunch go? He said, it went wonderfully, etc. Dean was a gentleman, And Walter felt very, very comfortable there. Walter was very considerate. When my daughter was born, Lily was class of 2000 at Cornell. Sandy, all of a sudden the package comes in the mail from Sandy and Walter, and it was a sterling silver little baby hairbrush, etc. So that was the type of person that Walt was. I only heard him curse once in 55 years, and that was one evening. We were watching television in his house, and some discussion came up about the Cornell Development Department, how they had completely screwed up some situation with a potentially wealthy donor, and who was called? Walter was called to smooth over the situation, which he did. As you well know, Walt was a company man in that he loved Cornell. Anytime he was asked to go somewhere, to lecture, to talk, he always did that, and probably Sandy would say he was always on the road talking to a small group, whether it was in Westchester, whether it was in Illinois or any other place there. So he was a very much, as I said, a company man, and he also was very instructive away from the classroom. And I was a moderate baseball fan, but we'd sit and listen. And I once asked him, I said, as we're watching it, it happened to be a Cub game, I think, and we won't hold that against him. But I said, well, so Walter, in those days they talked about something called a forkball, okay, baseball. And I said, what's the difference between a forkball and a slider and something else? Well, it was about a 10-minute lecture, and I had to prevent him from getting some paper and explaining to me the difference between a two-finger forkball or whatever. Walter was a very regular guy from what I could see. That is to say, many times he would be in his kitchen in the house. He loved ice cream. He loved to eat it directly from the container. There were many frowns from his wife who would say, Walter, and he said, well, it's one of my vices there. So Walter was a very, very good friend, a pal. I didn't have quite the intellectual relationship with him, but I would like to tip my hat to Walter and his family, and I just said it was a wonderful experience in my life.
Yeah, thank you. Any other reminiscing? I think we're it's probably the top of the second inning, I would guess. And pardon? 2-0 Rangers. Oh, 2-0 Rangers. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a thing. But thank you all for. Sure.
This is the perfect audience. Randy Ringler, ILR 76. I went into baseball professionally, which was a first. My grandfather in the 19-teens and 20s worked in New York City politics, was right-hand man to Jimmy Walker, some other things, also the Hip Sing Association, China, all these things. I have a medal from 1917 from the Russian War Commission that I've never been able to get anyone to tell me about. And if anyone here knows anything about it, I can show you the picture and I can bring it tomorrow. Let me know.
We'll definitely bring it tomorrow. I'm not sure we'll be able to enlighten you, but bring it tomorrow. Which reminds me, tomorrow we're having a series of panels drawn from the tribute volume, Thinking Otherwise, that we put together to honor Walt's work. So there'll be 6 sessions, beginning with the New Empire, America, Russia, and the Cold War, Inevitable Revolutions, The Clash, the Michael Jordan book, and then Walt's little-known finale, The Deadly Bet. And then on Sunday, we're very fortunate to have with us a group of people, including Eric Edelman, and Bob Einhorn, who went off into foreign policy making to sort of reminisce and to talk a little bit about how their experience in Walt's classes affected their careers in government service. So thank you all for being here tonight. This has been, pardon? They're going to, this upstairs, I think, is it not? Up here. In this? Okay.
Those who have signed up for breakfast, it'll be right out there from basically 8 to 9, and then the sessions will begin at 9. I see people nodding, there's going to be only 17, so that's what it is, 8 to 9.
Okay.
You know, 3 sessions of an hour long, and then lunch break, and then we start again at 1:30.
Well, thanks again for everyone for being here tonight. This has been really wonderful and reminiscing. And we hope to see you tomorrow and on Sunday as well. So thanks a lot. Good night.